The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. The Shangri-La Dialogue took place over the weekend here in Singapore, bringing together defense ministers, military leaders, and strategic thinkers from around the world. As expected, the conversations were dominated by concerns over Indo-Pacific security, U.S.-China competition, and rising tensions in the South China Sea. But one notable absence cast a long shadow over the dialogue. China's defense minister was not among the delegates. Now, that decision has sparked questions about China's willingness to engage in open strategic conversations, especially at a time when its actions and intentions are under intense scrutiny from its neighbors and global powers alike. So what does China's defense minister's absence really signal? Did Beijing miss a critical opportunity to shape the regional narrative? Well, to delve into this deeper, joining us today is Dr Lim Tai Wei, who is the East Asian expert and professor at Soka University. Hi, Dr. Lim. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello to you, and glad to be here.
Glad to have you on. Well, Dr. Lim, almost everyone was talking about China at the Shangri-La Dialogue this weekend. But for the first time since 2019, China's defense minister did not attend. What could be a reason for this decision? What message is China sending, by not sending its defense minister to the dialogue, especially amid heightened geopolitical tensions?
Well, I think with regards to the actual reason, it may be possible that we would not have, unmitigated response. This is because of a Chinese unique political system whereby the attendance is rather opaque. The reasons for the non-attendance is rather opaque. However, there have been reasons that are offered by international community, and they fall into three categories. The first category is that there are internal reforms going on in China, and therefore it may not be appropriate for him to attend as the military is undergoing some transitions right now. Second reason, well, the Minister of Defense is usually considered to be more of an emissary and envoy, an ambassador of sorts, rather than a policy maker, because the defense minister is under the directions of the Central Military Commission, which is headed by the president himself, as well as his number two within the CMC, which is General Zhang Youxia. So he may not be, the traditional mold of Western-type defense ministers. Thus, his non-attendance may not be as, consequential in that sense. Third reason, well, China is, high context political culture, and atmospherics and as well as symbolisms and imageries are very important. And if they do sense that there are fluidity and dynamic changes in the international environment, they may not want to be a part of this fluidity. So they may, in this case, send an academic delegation instead.
Okay. Well, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth mentioned China about 20 times in his speech as he urged other countries in the Indo-Pacific to increase their defense expenditure, buy more American arms, and buffer themselves against the so-called threat posed by China. I mean, China was not around to push back against the criticism leveled against it. Could this be a calculated loss that Beijing was prepared to accept?
Well, I think everyone, especially the stakeholders in the region, had very much hoped that they will be able to engage with the Chinese defense minister. However, the Chinese did send a rear admiral from their top academy, military academy, to attend. So in that sense, it is not a total loss because there are opportunities to engage with the delegation as well as its leader. Although most stakeholders would prefer that the defense minister could be here because the dialogue is a 1.5, some may even say between 1.5 to 2.0 track dialogue. So it's a good opportunity for the major powers, along with middle powers, regional powers, and small states to be able to have a dialogue with each other in a format that's rather open and constructive in that sense. Of course, there are three sort of prominent dialogues within Asia. You have the Shangri-La Forum, you also have the Xiangshan Dialogue in China, as well as the New Delhi Dialogue in India. So I guess it is possible that through the collective, materials from these three dialogues and, the meetings as well as corridor diplomacy within these three dialogues, it may be possible to have a greater exposure. Of course, most importantly, as the Americans have mentioned it themselves, themselves, there are many bilateral mechanisms in which the militaries could meet. And since the new Trump administration, Trump 2.0, took over, they have revived bilateral mechanisms to exchange information. And not just between the US and China, but between, for example, the Chinese and the Japanese, they also have their own dialogue mechanisms as well as exchanges, in addition to maritime hotline. So all these, cumulatively speaking, can contribute to greater understanding.
Okay, but does this leave the U.S. in an advantageous position in terms of regional ties?
Well, I don't think that any powers is seeking advantage through a dialogue. I think the main position is that they want to have a more understanding, because the fear is that there are, in a very polycrisis kind of world, that there may be misunderstanding, misconception, and misperception.
Right.
And these are kind of dangerous because they may result in accidental kinetic contact, which may be undesirable. Therefore, in this sense, whether it's the Secretary of the US of Defense or the other leaders that were giving talks at the dialogue, they all preface their materials, their speeches, with the hope and aspirations of avoiding a kinetic conflict and to maintain the peace if possible. After all, the slogan on the US side is peace through strength, quote and unquote.
Right. Well, the Chinese embassy in Singapore did, though, make an unusual move of posting a response to Mr. Hegseth's speech on its Facebook page, describing it as steeped in provocations and instigation and a relentless hyping of the China threat. But was China's overall response to its critics at the forum this year markedly low-key compared with the years prior?
Well, because of the fact that there are ongoing, tariff talks, there are, ongoing polycrisis in the world, but in particular, very significantly, the tariff talks that have recently yielded some positive developments, which was to bring down tariffs on both sides by 115%. So the idea is not to derail the progress that has been made in the temporary tariff reprieve for 90 days, because there will be additional rounds in which very important trade issues will need to be sorted out. Moreover, there are bilateral mechanisms that are away from the glare of the media that the militaries can quietly discuss how to avoid direct kinetic conflicts.
Okay, but Dr. Lim, what impact does China's absence at the ministerial level here have on such security dialogues and trust building in the region?
Because of China's very unique political system, the defense minister is not, located at the apex of the hierarchy when it comes to security efforts. However, almost contemporaneously, you can also see that Premier Li Qiang has met up with ASEAN and also the Gulf states for trade talks. So the engagement is there. Even at the highest level, where you have Premier Li Qiang, attending the regional events, just that at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is between 1.5 to 2.0, track 1.5 to 2.0, that you may not get the representation of the defense minister, who, as I mentioned earlier on, is not necessary at the top echelons of the policy making. So you do have a top leader coming down to talk about issues. Right now, I think many are focusing on the trade issues, very sort of anxious that the tariff wars and the impact they're having on all countries in the world.
Right. Well, speaking of trust here, Philippine Defense Chief Gilberto Teodoro Jr. called out on China, saying that a deficit of trust stands in the way of Beijing's ability to resolve disputes such as overlapping claims in the South China Sea. What do you think he meant by this? Could his remarks indicate that countries like the Philippines are growing more comfortable, aligning publicly against China?
Well, the Philippines is a treaty ally of the US. That is a very sort of a traditional and historical position. In fact, I think Secretary Hegseth has already mentioned this, that some of its allies in the regions have dated back for centuries. So in that sense, the Philippines is very close, treaty ally of the US. Therefore, it reflects its anxieties about its national interests, and at the same time, its traditional allies have also sort of, have similar positions in that sense.
Right.
So it is not sort of alarming. Moreover, the region has other mechanisms, for example, the Code of Conduct that currently is at a stage where all discussions of the COC, Code of Conduct on the South China Sea, is now gathered as well as compiled under a single document. The progress is slow, yes, but, it remains a possible mechanism in which regional conflicts can be, if not resolved, at least used to turn down the temperature. There are other models at play, for example, the bilateral maritime hotline between China and Japan, which has ratcheted down many disputes and disagreements to tune down the temperature. So it is possible that all these can come together to sort of restrain kinetic actions. What is worrying for many stakeholders in the region is the accidental kinetic conflicts. That's more important. Moreover, Philippines is part of the Squad, so it is also part of this doctrine of peace through strength, emphasis on peace.
Did any other regional counterparts echo the same tune at the dialogue?
Well, they did have a meeting between the Squad members, Philippines, US, Japan, Australia. And in that dialogue, they did discuss very important issues. For example, issues of intentionality of arms buildup mentioned by the Australian Defense Minister. So those are collective anxieties that the Squad has. In that sense, a common mutual interest that they have, and therefore they reflected it in that quadrilateral format kind of meeting. But it is always, discussions are always prefaced with the desire for peaceful resolution and responsible behavior. So all these are possible ways in which it can ratchet down the possible kinetic conflict. Perhaps the priority now is to find out more mechanisms, especially CBMs, confidence building measures, to address the deficit of trust that Secretary of Defense of the Philippines has mentioned.
Okay. Well, meanwhile, our Defense Minister, Mr. Tan Chun-sing, has called for direct dialogue between the United States and China to continue here. What key areas of dialogue does Mr. Chan, believe are essential for China and the U.S. to focus on to improve mutual understanding, you think?
The U.S. and China has a number of bilateral mechanisms in which they can have this dialogue and conversation. It was sort of put on hold during the previous administration, but it appears that the current administration, or at least nearer the end of the previous administration, these dialogues have come back into play again. And these kinds of dialogues allow them to have the comfort of discussing sensitive issues frankly, without the glare of the media or without sort of too much attention paid on performative politics or symbolisms. So it is these dialogues and perhaps an increase in frequency of more of these dialogues that can enable the two great superpowers to sit down, at least to tune down the temperature, even if they cannot resolve the problems.
Well, Mr. Tan also highlighted Singapore's role in facilitating dialogue between China and the U.S. How can Singapore effectively then mediate or encourage constructive conversations between these two nations?
Well, Singapore is always known in the international community as a country with a high integrity when it comes to international negotiations, and has been in the past a place that, enables it to be a platform for different parties to come together. Some examples in mind would be the Trump-Kim Summit in Trump 1.0 administration, and also in the past they have hosted dialogues with regards to cross-strait relations. So in that sense, Singapore, I think, is always open to the parties concerned to use it as a platform for having constructive dialogue. And Singapore's position of choosing, as Defense Minister Chan has mentioned, choosing based on principles and not choosing sides is what Singapore is well known for. Moreover, it is also a comprehensive strategic partner, a very deep one with the US, and at the same time, a友好 friendship partner with China.
Okay.
So this puts in a very good position to be a platform for any possible dialogues if and should the need arise. And of course, there are other players in the region that have also voiced their willingness to facilitate such communications.
Well, at the end of the day here, U.S. Defense Secretary Mr. Hegseth got the spotlight at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue. I mean, he called for Asian countries to increase their defense spending to match levels that Washington expects of European allies. Now, that's 5% of their respective GDP. Is this achievable, you think, Dr. Lim? How might Asian allies see this?
In the first Trump administration, the figure that the first Trump administration thought would be ideal and optimal in defense spending was 2%. And in the last few years, during the Biden administration as well, the countries concerned, in particular the allies of the US, For example, Republic of Korea, Japan, they have all worked very hard to hit the 2%. The current President Trump 2.0 administration would prefer to see a higher defense spending due to the intensifying polycrisis world that we are witnessing, not just in Europe, the Middle East, but also tensions in the South China Sea and cross straits as well as Korean Peninsula. So in this sense, US hopes that it can work with allies to be a force multipliers because Secretary Hegseth has said that the US cannot go on it alone. Looking at the world map, you can see that Pacific Ocean and now including the Indian Ocean is a very, very vast body of water. And so it's not possible even for a superpower to be able to, have its resources stretch against such wide body of water with multiple challenges from piracy, non-traditional security to conflicts in the region, supply chain disruptions, and also a very recent Indo-Pakistani kinetic conflict. So the US is being very pragmatic to tap onto traditional alliances with a very, very sharp focus on the slogan and the motto, which is peace through strength. So the doctrine that US believes is that in order to prevent war, countries have to show that it can defend themselves, not just defend themselves, but also be interoperable when it comes to collective defense. And therefore, with this peace through strength doctrine, he has urged the allies in the region to step up for peace.
Right. I mean, this call comes as Mr. Hegseth says Asia bears the brunt of the so-called threat of China and North Korea in their backyards. But Dr. Lim, how do you think China or even North Korea would respond to this?
Well, Chinese, relationship between China and the US is a very complex entity because there are multiple fronts. It's not just only about geopolitical or defense, but there are multiple fronts in which, cooperation will coexist with rivalry. Take, for example, even the lunar moon rocks that have been recovered from the moon by the Chinese space program were shared, with intellectuals and researchers at the university level, the US directly or indirectly. Therefore, this multiple fronts complex relationship requires a very strong management, but it is extremely complex and therefore great wisdom have to be applied by the two great superpowers to see how they can maximize areas in which they can cooperate while avoiding conflict, especially, accidental conflict. And repeatedly, President Trump has said that he has very good relationship with President Xi. He has also publicly mentioned many times with regards to the tariff issue that he hopes that all countries, including China, can do well. And Secretary Hegseth has also prefaced his speech by saying that the US, respects the ancient Chinese civilization and the achievements of its people. So there are preface for peace, and hopefully through very complex multiple channels, multiple mechanisms, and personal diplomacy between two very dynamic leaders, that the kinetic aspect of the relationship can be avoided, especially an accidental one.
Well, to wrap up our conversation here, Dr. Lim, overall, did China shoot itself in the foot by ceding the space at the annual forum for the U.S. to run with its narrative of rallying allies and partners in the region against Beijing? I mean, will China never send its defense minister again to the Shangri-La Dialogue moving forward?
Well, according to the statistics provided by stakeholders of People's Liberation Army, there have been 5 times that the defense minister, I think, attended, and he has not always been, attending this event. So I think this has to be attributed to both external and internal events within China. External, as I've mentioned earlier on, the atmospherics, whether it's positive or negative, the fluidity of polycrisis world, whether, they feel that it's appropriate time for their leaders to appear. But also internally, in terms of internal politics, they would also have to take into consideration the priorities, the perceptions, as well as how people view participation and non-participation. So it is not a consideration only based on pragmatic matters, but it is also based on the high context political culture of China, not just China, but Northeast Asia, of how their internal audiences will perceive any meetings should their leaders engage with other great powers.
Some great insights from you there, Dr. Lim. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and hope to contribute in the future as well.
All right. Well, that was Dr. Lim Tai Wei, who is an East Asian expert and professor at Soka University. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.